Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a new Affinity webinar episode of Virtual Couch Conversation in collaboration with the Institute for Economics and Peace, the IEP. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from where we're broadcasting today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and all the clans of the Darug language. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to all descendants who've cared for this place since creation. We also honour all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. My name is Pauline Wright. I'm the President of the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties, and I'm honoured to be a member of the Advisory Board of the Affinity Intercultural Foundation. Tonight, we're gathered to share the launch of the 2021 Global Peace Index, or GPI, which ranks 163 independent states and territories according to their level of peacefulness. Produced by the IEP, the GPI is the world's leading measure of global peacefulness. During this webinar, you'll hear from Steve Killerley, AM, founder and executive chairman of IEP, as he shares his valuable insights. We'll discuss advances in peace and a world in which certain conflicts and crises that emerged in the past decade have begun to abate, only to be replaced by a new wave of uncertainty arising from the COVID-19 pandemic and an escalation in tensions between certain major world powers. As a global philanthropist, Steve Killerley has laid the foundations to develop an entirely new understanding of peace. As a thought leader, he's reshaped the whole concept to recognise its integrity to the revival of our economic and political systems. An international entrepreneur behind global think tank, the Institute for Economics and Peace, he combines a highly successful career in technology with a philanthropic focus on peace and sustainable development to shed new light on issues from terrorism and conflict to economics and prosperity. Steve's philanthropy and thought leadership behind the Institute has seen him recognised as one of the world's 100 most influential people on reducing the onset of armed violence. As one of the world's most impactful think tanks, the IEP's research is extensively used by multilaterals, including the United Nations, the World Bank, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, as well as thousands of university courses around the world. Steve currently serves on the President's Circle for Club de Madrid, the largest forum of democratic former presidents and prime ministers working to strengthen democracy. He's an honorary president for Religion for Peace, the largest organisation in the world working on interreligious challenges. Steve also sits on several other influential not-for-profit boards and is a regular speaker at international forums on conflict, peace, governance and development. So welcome, and a warm welcome to you, Steve. Before you begin your presentation though, would you explain to us the Global Peace Index? What is it and how do you measure peace, given that this index covers 99.7% of the world's population? And what do you take into account before making an assessment?
Sure. Okay. Thanks for the question, Pauline. Okay, we'll skip over those slides when we get to the presentation. So we use the absence of violence or fear of violence as the definition of peace. And that's called negative peace, but it's good because it's a definition most people can agree on. So what we've done then is we're guided by a panel of international experts, and what we do is we look at three different domains. And so the first domain is safety and security, and that looks at the internal safety and security within a country. So it covers things like homicides, violent demonstrations, level of policing, level of incarceration, terrorism, and so forth. The second, the three domains, is ongoing conflict, which is fairly self-evident. And the third domain, and the final domain, that's militarisation. And so that covers things like the sophistication of the military weapons. Obviously, if they've got nuclear weapons, that gets the highest of scores. Percentage of GDP spent on the military, it's not the absolute amount, but the percentage of GDP spent on the military, because we think that's a fairer way of assessing the militarisation of a country. The number of troops per 100,000 population, weapons imports, exports. These create 23 different indicators which we pull together. Now we can analyse by those three domains, or alternately we can break it down into internal or external peace, and also look at it by that mechanism as well. So that's basically a construct of the index.
Well, thanks very much, Steve. It's obviously a really complex analysis and way of indexing that level of peacefulness. So we'll look forward to hearing your presentation.
Great. Look, you're looking forward to giving it. Okay. Right. Okay. So look, here's the presentation. It's a fairly fast-moving presentation. I'll talk for about 25 minutes, I suppose, and then obviously we'll open up for questions. So the Institute for Economics and Peace was set up to understand the intersection between business, peace and economics. It's placed a special emphasis on metrics to measure peace, then ascribe an economic value to changes in peace. We're headquartered in Sydney, Australia, and we have offices in Brussels, Den Haag or The Hague, in Belgium, Zimbabwe, Mexico City and New York. The work's extensively used, as it was mentioned in the introduction, by all the major multilaterals, including the OECD, Commonwealth Secretariat, World Bank, the United Nations. And we do contract research also for all those different organisations. The work's now included in thousands of university courses around the world, and sort of in any one year we get last year I guess, we got 24 billion media impressions, 1.2 billion social media impressions, and there was the coverage of our work in 152 different countries around the world. We're also now, according to Google Scholar, referenced in over 6,000 different published pieces of research. So the work is widely used. We're now in the 15th year. It covers 163 countries, 99.7% of the world's population. Uses 23 indicators developed by us, but guided by a group of international experts. And as I mentioned in the introduction, three different domains: ongoing conflict, international conflict, which has 6 indicators, safety and security or the internal measures, that has 10 indicators, and 7 measures of militarisation. And all these 23 indicators to come together to create the index. Now, let's move in to the findings. So this is a quick map of the world. Blue is very, very good, and red is very, very bad. So you'll notice from this that Middle East and North Africa are the areas with the most red, or orange, which is bad. Find that Europe, Eastern and Western Europe, are the most peaceful areas of the world. And so this year we can find that Europe has actually increased in peacefulness again, which I'll come to a little bit further on. So now if we look at the changes in peace this year, peace deteriorated by 0.07%. And so if we look back over the last 13 years, 9 of them have actually been deterioration. So it's decreased on more years than it's increased. But this is also the second smallest change we've had in peace since we've been doing the index. But what we can see is that 87 countries improved, while only 73 deteriorated. And what this highlights, that it's like the deteriorations in peace are much faster than improvements. So once you fall in peace, it does take time to get back up. And so if we look at it in the 2020, the improvements were driven by improvements in ongoing conflict, both in the internal number of conflicts and the intensity of conflicts, and also the number of battlefield deaths. And also terrorism improved. Now this is for the 6th consecutive year that terrorism's been improving as well. Now if we look at the deteriorations which occurred in the year, what we noticed that militarisation deteriorated, military expenditure in particular, and then a number of measures in the safety and security. They were mainly driven by, which I'll come to in a few minutes. Now, we look at the largest deteriorations in the index this year. Violent demonstrations, 3 times as many countries fell on violent demonstrations than improved. Political instability also increased, with twice as many countries falling in increasing in political instability compared to those which improved. But militarisation, we found that 97 countries globally deteriorated on their scores of militarisation. What's important here is that changes probably what's now been at least a 10-year trend of decreasing levels of militarisation. We saw that last year, in 2019, they started to stabilise, and then what we found is in 2020, they actually deteriorated. And what we put, this may be a change in a long-term trend. It's what we can see is the rising geopolitical tensions, see it between, let's say, the US and Russia, Europe and Russia, and also between the US, China, and China with a number of its neighbours. So with these increased, these heightened tensions in the geopolitical sphere, I think more countries are now spending on their military. And I think we'll see that trend just continue at least for the next couple of years. But on the positive note, as we come down and we look at sort of the improvements, deaths from internal conflict, as I've already mentioned, and also the intensity of internal conflict, and also deaths from terrorism, which now improved for the 6th consecutive year. So now if you look at some of the highlights, Iceland is the most peaceful country in the world, has been for a long while, and although it did slightly deteriorate this year. Ukraine and Iraq had the largest improvements, which is interesting to see Iraq now start to bounce back. And again, you can see both of those have been past high conflict countries. The Middle East and North Africa had the largest regional improvement. However, it still remains the least peaceful region in the world. And Europe remains the most peaceful region that's in the world. Now, its improvements were mainly driven by improvements in the terrorism indicator. What we do with that, we take a 5-year sliding average of terrorism attacks. So this is stuff falling off from what's happened 5 years ago at the height of the ISIS operations into Europe. 8 of the 10 most peaceful countries now reside in Europe. The other 2 is New Zealand, which is number 2, and Canada. If we look on the negative side, Afghanistan remains the world's least peaceful nation. However, it did record a slight increase in peacefulness. And that was a decrease in the number of people killed through terrorism and also a decrease in the number of battlefield deaths. And this sort of corresponded with the peace talks, or more likely the withdrawal of the US troops from Afghanistan. Burkina Faso and Belarus recorded the largest deteriorations. Burkina Faso on the back of the conflict within the country and the rise of Islamists there. Belarus was on mainly around political instability, increases in violent demonstrations and suppression. North America had the largest regional deterioration. Now, North America only consists of 2 countries, Canada and the US. Canada actually slightly improved from memory, and North America was really driven by an increase in political instability and violent demonstrations, which we see expressed through a number of different areas, such as the Black Lives Matters movement. There was some stuff around the economy, and also the political instability that came back to the elections and the inability of the country to accept the results, and obviously the storming of Capitol Hill. So now 6 of the 9 regions in the world recorded deteriorations. 3 which improved: Middle East and North Africa, Europe and South Asia. So they were the 3 which improved, the rest deteriorated. Now let's have a look at the most peaceful countries in the world, and just again it comes back to 8 of those countries that now reside in Europe, and that's the most countries from Europe residing in the top 10 since we've been doing the index. So last year Singapore was here, but it's dropped off slightly, and that's mainly due to increases in militarisation within the country. Now, if we look at the bottom of the index, we go down there, we can see Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, South Sudan and Iraq. The only country in the bottom 10 which hasn't actually got an internal war going on is Russia. But the good news is if we look at the bottom 5, 4 of those countries actually improved in 2020. So that's a sign, that's a reversing trend, which I'll come to in a few minutes. We look at the 5 most improved countries. Obviously Iraq was the most, followed by the Ukraine, but others are Poland, North Macedonia and Vietnam. If we look at the deteriorations, Burkina Faso and Belarus I've mentioned, but others were Honduras, Azerbaijan and Zambia. Honduras and Zambia were related around increases in the levels of crime. Zambia also has some political instability. In Azerbaijan, obviously the conflict which it had with Armenia. Now, let's come back and look at COVID-19 and the effects COVID-19 had on peace. So what we noticed was in the early stages of the lockdowns in 2020, violence actually fell. We saw violent demonstrations go down, homicides, violent crime also fell. But moving towards the end of 2020, we noticed they returned to their pre-COVID-19 levels. So now, what has happened is we've found that there's been an increase in civil unrest. So civil unrest expressed particularly through violent demonstrations was up 10% in 2020. So there's approximately 15,000 violent demonstrations in that year. Now, there were also 5,000 COVID-related instances in 2020 as well. And some of them was sort of the violence related to people just not committing violence because they've been told to wear masks or for other restrictions. Others for full-scale demonstrations, which I'll come to. So we also found that political instability also increased with 46 countries deteriorating. As I mentioned, that's twice as many countries which improved. And a lot of that was exacerbated by demonstrations against COVID-19. Now, the long-term impact on homicides, violent crime and suicides in this stage is unclear. But what we can say is what's going to be really important for the long-term impacts of COVID-19 is going to be the economic conditions which come out of the back end of it. So if there's a major downturn in the economic conditions, we think that's likely to lead to higher levels of political instability, more violent demonstrations, and which is expressed as political unrest. Now, this is a quick mud map of the world where red is bad. This shows where the violence incidence is globally related. You'll note that the most actually occurred in India. The second most occurred through Europe. And we can also see South America, North and South America also had many incidences related to the lockdowns as well. These arranged for a whole range of different reasons. Now, as mentioned, the economic recovery will be the key factor to determine whether civil unrest continues to grow, and that is going to be really important to watch. But what we've found is that countries with high levels of positive peace are better placed to make quicker recoveries from the pandemic. So what we found is that if we looked at the OECD countries with high levels of positive peace had unemployment rates of under 5% in 2020. That compared to up to 23% in the lower positive peace countries. So that gives us an idea of which countries are most likely to improve. And so we looked at sort of the levels of debt of countries, their levels of resilience as measured through the positive peace. The countries with the lower levels of debt means they've got more economic capacity, to stimulate a recovery. And also the ones with the high levels of positive peace, the better resilience or adaptability to be able to recover as well. And these countries are Czech Republic, Estonia, Germany, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Norway, Singapore, Slovenia, and Switzerland. And so you'll notice a number of them are Eastern European countries. Now let's start to look at some of the longer term trends in peace. So if we look at it over the last 15 years, 75 countries improved in peacefulness and 86 countries deteriorated. And that caused peace to decline by about 2%. But if we took the wars in the Middle East out and the knock-on effects from them, actually peace in the last decade would have improved. And so what this shows is just that before starting wars, one really needs to think, are they really necessary? Because the long-term issues just flow on. And we can see that a lot of the wars which have started in the last decade, ramifications are still there. Iraq, Syria, Libya, just to name some. Now, this just gives you an idea of the overall changes in peacefulness in the time we've been doing the index. Low on this graph is good, high is bad. And you can see that it's just been this gradual decline since 2014. It had been improving for a number of years prior to that. But the gradual decline really came about with the start of the rise of ISIS in Iraq and then its flow-on effects into Syria. Now, we've been looking at a rising global inequality in peace. And we see since about 2012, or over the last decade, that the countries which are the least peaceful are becoming less peaceful, and the countries which are most peaceful are becoming more peaceful. We can see that this trend just in the last year, with 4 of the 5 least peaceful countries in the world improving, that trend's actually broken. So that may be something which bodes well for the future, but we'll need to watch that for another couple of years. Now, we start to look at the various domains, and we'll look at 3 different indicators out of each. We can see that violence demonstrations, they're increased by 251% in the last decade. We can see that although it went up quickly, plateaued for a while, but since about 2017 it's been on the rise again. People forcibly displaced. So if we look at that since 2008, there are twice as many people now which are living in refugee camps or internally displaced centres, and that's up from 40 million up to 80 million. And one on the positive side, but we can see homicide rates globally have been decreasing, other than in South America where they have been increasing. But the story on the homicide rates globally is good. Now, if we come back and we look at civil unrest, which I mentioned earlier on, this will give you an idea of just the change over the last decade, which can just see this slowly rising. So we look back on 2020, the reasons for the demonstrations are very varied. So you've got Black Lives Matter movements. We've seen it here in Australia, we've seen it in the UK, certainly seen it in the US. You've got demonstrations against agricultural policy in India. Down in Latin America, there's a lot of demonstrations which have been going on against economic austerity. We can see the demonstrations which occurred in Myanmar after the coup. And Belarus, we can see again demonstrations there related to the repression of the civil rights. And so there's a variety of reasons for these increasing, but they all come back and underlie decreasing measures in many areas of positive peace globally. And these are things like the fractionalisation within societies, levels of perceived levels of corruption, faith in the democratic political systems, group grievances are on the rise, eroding working conditions, and in some countries even eroding wages. So all these are background conditions which are fueling what you can see on this chart. We go over the ongoing conflict domain. We can see since the peak of ISIS. You can see the battlefield deaths have declined. However, the total number of conflicts have gone up. They've fallen a little bit the last 2 years, and as is the intensity of conflict as well. So there's a lot of conflicts out there which are low levels of conflict, and in this case it's where a conflict is where more than 10 people die in a year in it. And also the intensity have gone up, but they're a lot lower level, but it has reversed in the last year, so hopefully that's a future trend. If we look at militarisation, we can see armed force, number of people in the armed forces have been, as a percentage of population, have been deteriorating since 2008. We can see since about 2017 it's starting to kick back up. Again, with military expenditure, we can see it's kicking back up with the lows of 2013 and 14. And we can see weapons imports have jumped sizably in the last year as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about the value of peace. So if we look at the cost of violence to the global economy in 2020, it was $15 trillion. So that amounts to about 10.6% of global GDP, or about nearly $2,000 a year per person per capita. Considering half the world lives on under $700 a year, that gives you a pretty clear indication of how far this money could go if it was distributed correctly. But none of us can imagine a world which is totally peaceful, but we can imagine a world 10% more peaceful. That would be the equivalent of $1.5 trillion. And that's the equivalent of, let's say, adding 3 new countries to the world, the size of Switzerland, Denmark, and Iceland. So that is a profound amount of money. So we can reduce the cost of violence. That's what it means. We look up the breakup of this, and about 40% of it goes into military expenditure, and another 30% goes on measures of internal security and such. Now, we come down, we're looking at the peace and the perceptions of risk. So we did a whole lot of surveying on this, and what we found that the fear of violent crime, 60% of people globally are worried about being affected by violent crime. 75%, however, on the positive side, 75% of people feel more safer, as safe as what they did 5 years ago. We can find that 5%, but there's a difference in the perceptions between male and female, with 5% more women fearing being the victim of violence compared to men. And this can vary up to 20%. So in Sweden, for example, 23% more women fear being the victim of violence. I'm just going to flip through a few slides now. But when we look at this, road-related accidents, the thing which people worry about the most. The second is being a victim of crime. Now, this survey was done in 2019, so health issues may have risen since the advent of COVID, so that may have changed. I'll just move forward a bit, I think. So we can find that there's quite differences in the way countries perceive it. So if we're looking at the countries which feel they experience the most violence, you can see they're all in South Africa. The countries which feel they experience the least of it are places like Poland, Singapore, Japan, Uzbekistan, and Turkestan. We start to look at feelings of safety. What we find there, when people feel they're feeling more safe or less safe than 5 years ago, the ones where it's decreased are places like Lebanon, Hong Kong, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Zambia. The ones where they're feeling a lot more safe than what they were, it's places like China, UAE, Cambodia, Estonia, and Singapore. Now, I'll finish this up in a couple of minutes. This is probably the last section I'll go through. So the thing which we found quite profound, we were looking at the ways of being able to predict countries which were going to fall in peace. So what we did is we took the Global Peace Index, compared it to positive peace, and the positive peace gives an indicator of how peaceful countries are likely to be. where the actual peace was much higher than the positive peace it indicated, we found over time that these countries fell. And so we found that if we went back to 2009, the 10 countries, the largest deficits, 9 of those countries actually had large deteriorations in peace. So to be able to actually fix problems in countries, you need a long lead time to do it. So positive peace can act as an excellent predictor of future changes in peace. Now, that, my friends, is the end of the presentation. I'd just like to make a mention. I've written a book called Peace in the Age of Chaos. It sort of covers my own personal experiences to peace. It's got a lot of stories out of many of the development places I've been, some of the war zones I've been to. It covers the thinking behind the Global Peace Index, and it's also an entrepreneurial story about how do you develop a global think tank. So if people are interested, you can buy the book from any of the normal places you go to buy a book. So thank you. That's the end of my presentation. So
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. The Global Peace Index has been around for several years now. Have your findings ever influenced governments' attitudes against arming or fighting in wars? Have you found that?
look, the indexes are highly influential. I'd get every 2 to 3 months an ambassador from some country coming in making comments on their country's rankings. You'll find things like the Morgan Stanley Composite Index, the Global Peace Index is used in that in their ESG measures, for example. Would be had work down in Mindanao with the government down there in the Philippines on sort of the reintegration of the ex-rebels. In fact, they're going to try and roll the positive peace framework out globally, sorry, not globally, right through all the provinces in the Philippines, but that fell down with COVID. And with Mexico, for example, would be another one, for example. So we train the military there, train the police there on positive peace. I guess the cost of violence, the global economy, that gets quoted by multiple Secretary Generals of the UN, and there's just some of it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you mentioned before that obviously there's this very clear correlation between the positive peace deficit and the likelihood of conflict. And a lot of surveys show that people are opposed to war and conflict as a means of resolving disputes between nations. How is it that even democratic governments ignore those surveys and those outcomes and openly prepare for more wars?
Yeah, look, I think this is a very, very, very complicated area. Most people don't want to go to war, okay, but also we know that getting tough on crime works as a political strategy. And so being strong on defence is generally in most countries is a pretty good political tactic. So that's the first thing which is there. We have seen over the last decade that actually militarisation has been improving. So that although and that's really came back to and that's quite a long-term trend. However, we have seen that in reverse in the last couple of years. A lot of that's got to do with the international tensions, which I mentioned earlier on, particularly between Russia, US, China, and the neighbours of those countries.
Yeah. So, just talking about the US and China, US and Russia for a moment, your experts have Russia in the red zone, while the US is only in the yellow zone. And some have commented that both those nations are equally warlike. So, how is that affected? How does that happen?
Sure, we've got 23 different indicators. So what you'll find is that both of them are sort of probably rate fairly similar on the militarisation domain and ongoing conflict domain. However, so if you look at the internal safety and security, so the US is 122, so it's not like it's well up the index. But certainly the levels of state-sponsored suppression in Russia are greater.
Yep.
than what you'll find in the US. The homicide rates are greater. Both of them have high incarceration rates, although the US does have one of the highest in the world. You've got a lot availability of small arms, like you've got them available in the US in high numbers, but they're also there in Russia as well. And so you'll find it comes back to a number of the internal safety and security measures more than anything else.
And
Also,
similarly, yes,
also the international relations. So you've got Russia's got had real issues with some of the countries on its borders. The Ukraine's the best one, best example we could think of that. Then it's obviously they seized territory from the Ukraine recently down in the Crimea, and you've got all those tensions, and those spill over into sort of making Russia just that much more or less peaceful.
yep, yep. And similarly, we see that Cambodia and Myanmar are not placed in the red zone, while they're both clearly
Yeah.
guilty of the destruction of democracy, and in the case of Myanmar, genocide. So I guess that also reflects those different indices that you've referred to.
Not really, because what happened with Myanmar, the coup happened after the cut-off date for the index. So it's the 31st of March is the cut-off date for the index. So that came a little bit later. So what you're right is you get like Cambodia's got a lot of issues, but it's well down the index. It's well down the index. But its militarisation is not as strong. So really, to get right down the bottom, you need to be low on all three domains. But Cambodia is well down the index. I've forgotten where it is. Could be in the 130s.
Yeah. Okay. And as you've said, the 2021 findings show global peace has deteriorated for the ninth year in a row, and military spending is ramping up. As you said, the report covers 99.7% of the entire world: Palestine, Yemen, Iraq, across Latin America and Africa. And according to the report, peacefulness fell just 97 99.7, sorry, 0.07%, which doesn't sound like a lot. What does that have to say about levels of world peace?
Well, what I think it says is like quite often we get caught up in trying to get simplistic views of a very, very complex phenomena. And what it says is there's a whole lot of positive trends going on there as well as negative trends. And sort of in different stages of the history, and we'll talk short-term history like 7 years ago, you'll get indicators there which are improving, which are now deteriorating and vice versa. And also countries, if you look at it, it's a lot more balanced. Countries improving and deteriorating than what one expect. The world doesn't move in unison. So I think it's complex, and we really got to look at the individual situations to understand them. And obviously, when you give a presentation like this, you reduce it down to the bigger things. So if you're looking at political instability, and we know twice as many countries deteriorated in their political stability than improved. It was 46 countries which deteriorated. A lot of other
Yep.
ones remained fairly stable.
Okay. And in terms of TV media, the lack of peace appears to have been most noticeable because of the 11-day war in Palestine. The results indicate that Palestine is more peaceful than Russia. How does that conclusion
Again,
happen?
comes back to be a different story next year, because again, the recent troubles in Palestine and Israel came after the cut-off period, which is the 31st of March for the index.
Right, I see. And just going down to military spending, the biggest military spenders are the United States, the UK, France, Germany, and Korea. And in the places with the lowest levels of peace, we find weapons made by those countries, that's the US, the UK, France, Germany, and Korea, being commonly deployed and used. Is there a direct correlation with military spending and low levels of peace?
Uh, None of the countries which are got huge arms exports are up right at the top of the index. And from memory, that out of those countries we've just mentioned, probably the UK would be the highest. It's from memory, it's about 32. So none of them are well up there. But it gets very, very hard to draw really hard conclusions. Okay, so certainly having better controls on arms exports would be very, very good. Okay, I'm all for better control on arms. But if you've got Islamic terror, certainly you're not going to find the major powers selling weapons to Islamic terrorists, let's say, in the Horn of Africa. So if we look at terrorism, admittedly it's been decreasing in the last 6 years, which is great. But if we went over to the Horn of Africa and Sahel, we've got the 5 countries with the largest increases in terrorism are all in that area, and it's all related back to Islamist extremists who'd have some sort of links or alliances back with IS or Islamic State. So now you've got, let's say, you've got Mali, for example. You might have a regime there which is reasonably toxic, but again, it's better than taking the alternative, having the country overrun by a group very similar to Islamic State. So a lot of it gets really complex. But again, I won't shy away from it. Having better controls on arms exports would only be good. And certainly there are people buy weapons for 2 reasons. One, they want to use it. Sometimes it's quite coercive to get their own way with a neighbour. Other times they do it because they really feel they need protection.
The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council all hold weapons of mass destruction, which are obviously there as a...
That's why they're members. That's why they're the permanent members of the Security Council.
Yeah. So they're the most powerful nations of the 21st century, and together, if they banded together, they'd be powerful enough to resolve conflict. Why can't they, or why don't they do that? Why don't they resolve to prevent conflict before it happens?
Well, I think you've got a lot of the geopolitical competition going on. So, for example, like if we're looking at nuclear weapons, there's just been, according to US intelligence anyway, China now has built about 150 new ballistic silos scattered across China, all capable of launching a nuclear weapon. And so, from the Chinese perspective, that as it gets more militarily active, let's say in the South China Sea, it just acts as a deterrent against the US getting involved there and launching attacks on China. So it's this geopolitical zero-sum game which is going on, and you see it played out between the Western powers and Russia over a long period of time. You're seeing it played out now between China and the US. Something about major powers, when they get too big, they want to throw their weight around.
Yeah.
Don't know what more to say.
Okay. Well, thanks, Steve. We might move on to talk about the impacts of or the impacts of COVID-19. And you mentioned that the lasting, lingering effects of COVID-19 have really become a factor in measuring the levels of peace. Is that right?
It plays out indirectly. So obviously, sort of things like we can see reductions initially in violent crime and homicides, violent demonstrations because people weren't going out on the streets, but that didn't last long. So we got back towards the end of 2020, that all bounced back to their pre-COVID levels. In fact, demonstrations were up, violent demonstrations were up. And so, as I said through the presentation, the real issue going forward is COVID-19 and the impact it has on the economy. Because in higher levels of unemployment, you've got no social security nets, which is the case in most places. It's just likely to increase crime. Economic austerity measures, when they're introduced, they're never popular. That can lead to violent demonstrations. We've seen a lot of them in Latin America over the last year. And also, it leads to political instability as well. Governments they're democratically elected, even with flawed democracies. There's a lot more tension around the rise of the populist parties, for example. Could be far right, could be far left, and so the systems become less stable. Is probably the best way to put it. And that can then flow on into a whole range of other things. Could be high levels of state-sponsored terrorism,
Yeah.
state-sponsored terror on their citizens as people try to governments try to hold on to power more. We've seen quite a bit of that, so more suppression, more people getting jailed for political reasons as people try and hang on to power, and a range of other things that can spill over into as well.
And what about the impact of COVID-19 on your institute itself? I mean, has the institute's work been affected by the barriers to travel, for instance, created by the pandemic?
Yeah, look, that's a good point. Yes, so the answer to that's yes. So there's silver linings in this too, I must admit. So I haven't travelled. I used to do 6 around the world trips a year, lasting from maybe 3 to 5 weeks. Then, like, I haven't done one. So running international operations when you're not travelling is a lot harder. So networks, when you're not meeting people face to face, you used to go to conferences, so you talk, you get down in the green room afterwards, you chat, you make new acquaintances, you go and have a beer with them or meals with them, and you build ways of build your network and bond out. None of that anymore, so your networks in some ways erode somewhat, okay, so it's a lot harder to do it over the phone. But on the upside, it's much easier now to be able to give the presentations. Look at this webinar. How many webinars were we doing before COVID? I reckon we've out of IEP in the last 12 months, we've probably done something like 250, 300 webinars. It's a lot. It really is a lot. And so from that angle, we've reached a lot more people. Similarly, sort of with some of the webinars we do, put a bit of social media marketing behind it, and we get the 250,000, up to 500,000 views of the videos from sort of the different events we've done. And so that's the silver lining, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess the philosophy and definitions of what it is to be at peace obviously change over time and in different circumstances, different nations. And I guess during the coronavirus crisis, we've seen some people accusing richer countries of vaccine apartheid or a vaccine war by richer countries against the global south. And there have been political arguments about why, for instance, Britain is not donating more vaccines to the global south. Have you considered how this is going to affect global peace in the future?
Yeah, I think it's this complicated scenario. I think most countries will look after their own citizens first. Okay, I think that's
Yep.
just the nature of a sovereign state. Okay, it'll look after its own citizens first. Then it'll get round to thinking about the rest of the world.
Yep.
So as time moves on, the richer nations are the ones they've got more money to be able to buy it. So you get into a lot of the impoverished nations that they do have to rely on things like the global funds for vaccinations and distribution through that. But as time moves on, it will roll out through a lot of these places. But in a lot of countries, getting an uptake of people to take the vaccinations is difficult. Even countries like Japan, historically, very few people over there get vaccinated. Okay, just against the normal things we just take for granted you get vaccinated against in the West. So the rollout of the vaccinations will be different in different countries. The take-up will be different. There's all sorts of, particularly if you get down into some of the poorer, less educated countries, all sorts of rumours are running around about what the vaccines do. And so it gets tough, but countries generally, the first thing they'll do is look after their own citizens. And so we'll take an extreme case, okay? We'll say the UK decided to give all its vaccines to the country which was most affected. We'll say India, okay, for example. How long would that government survive politically?
Yep, yep. And what about in Australia? Do you think there's any difference in peace in Australia through the impact of COVID-19? Are we seeing more violent demonstrations and incidents here?
Well, we haven't had much in the way of the cases, and we've had very, very little in the way of lockdowns. So I'm dealing with people in Europe, and they've been working from home for 8 months, 10 months now, and like that's when you're dealing with them regularly. It's a very, very different experience and feeling.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I think, yeah. So it's so Australia, we've been lucky. Okay, from that angle, we've been lucky. We're slow on the rollout of the vaccines, and I think that's something we really need to pick the pace up, and we need to have a lot more variety in other than just AstraZeneca. So
yeah,
I think we could have done a better job on the rollouts, but Australia's world class in terms of its ability to control the virus. There's a handful of countries in the world which have done as well.
yeah, yeah. I think that's probably right.
Now, if we
And
we come back to the violence, but there are sort of some areas where you can see it uptick, and so that would be sort of domestic violence. So they haven't got actually clear figures on it at this stage, but anecdotal evidence, so domestic violence is up. We'd also see that mental anguish and grief is up, which will probably get reflected in higher suicide numbers as well.
yeah, yeah. Okay, good. And what about if we talk about China, a highly populated country? I mean, that could have a huge impact on increases in peace if that was under control. How would you look at that? Even
So
though there are,
we measure peace on the country average.
yeah,
Otherwise, the whole of the index would be slanted towards India and China because between them they make up a third of the world's population, or more than
yeah,
that actually. So what we do is with the indexes calculate on the average of a country's peace. Okay, now
yeah,
certainly when you get into powers like China and its approach to international relations, that does come back and affect peace and also sort of and obviously if you're looking just on a person basis, big impact on its own population.
yeah. And there are human rights issues that have been raised about China, in particular, the treatment of the Uyghur people, which would no doubt affect its peacefulness ratings.
Yes, the way we account for that, we take it and treat it as being 2 million people in jail. That's basically
Yeah,
basically the way we treat it. Yeah, and so, but then again, when you're looking at a population of 1.3 billion, it has impact, but not as much impact as you'd think.
okay. Well, thanks, Steve, very much for that
Okay.
fascinating and insightful conversation. Um, and I just reiterate to people viewing this tonight, just do have a look for Steve's recently published book, Peace in an Age of Chaos. It tells of his personal journey to measure and understand peace and explores the practical application of his work, which is gathering momentum at a really rapid pace. So, in this time when we're faced with environmental, social, and economic challenges, this book shows us a way forward where positive peace, described as creating the optimal environment for human potential to flourish, can lead to a paradigm shift in the way societies can be managed, thereby transcending and reinvigorating Western democracies. So, if you want to order a copy of Peace in the Age of Chaos, you can go to www.peaceintheageofchaos.org and type in the promo code OZ20 upon checkout for an exclusive 20% discount on either the hard copy or digital version of the book. So, thank you once again, Steve. It's been a delight to talk to you. But to conclude, I'd like to call upon the Executive Director of Affinity Intercultural Foundation, Amit Paulat, to make some closing remarks.
Thank you, my esteemed cousin Pauline. Good evening, everyone, and my newly extended families, uncles, aunties, and cousins. Thank you for virtually joining tonight to Affinity's webinar episode. It is a deep honor, privilege, and pleasure to co-host this event with the Institution for Economics and Peace and New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties. First and foremost, happy NAIDOC Week. For those of you joining internationally, NAIDOC Week is an opportunity for all Australians to come together and celebrate the rich history, diverse cultures, and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the oldest continuing cultures on the planet. The Institute for Economics and Peace is clearly a well-established and influential institution, and like the IEP, Affinity is dedicated to shifting the world's focus to peace as a positive, achievable, and tangible measure of human well-being and progress. My cousin Steve, thank you for your powerful and edifying introduction to this year's Global Peace Index. I would also like to note Steve's approach is very unique. Rather than focusing on the most violent countries, Steve researched peace and the most peaceful countries to learn from and use as exemplary figures. I'd also like to thank my esteemed cousin Pauline for generously facilitating, and cousin Charlie, who assisted with the running of the program behind the scenes. Tonight, the key findings from the report were analyzed, together with a closer analysis of specific country-level findings. It has become right to say that true peace has become more relevant today than ever in addressing the problems of humanity. In the context of problems we face in our globalized world, every individual is to be as an exemplary member of the human family, a source of profound learning and inspiration, like Gandhi, Mandela, and other prominent figures. Those who want to reform the world must first reform themselves, purifying their inner worlds of hatred, hostility, and jealousy, and adorn their outer worlds with virtue. Peace has to begin in relationships between people, and you can only build those relationships by getting to know each other. Within learning and implying the positive peace, which describe an optimal environment where human potential can flourish. As Steve highlighted tonight and in his book, we are citizens of the world, and we should try within our capacity to improve the peacefulness of the world and to hopefully build a peaceful international civil society built on mutual respect, hospitality, trust, and cooperation. I'd like to quote from Dalai Lama. Peace does not mean an absence of conflicts. Differences will always be there. Peace means solving these differences through peaceful means, through dialogue, education, knowledge, and through humane ways. At Affinity, we see our differences as a richness rather than as a cause of conflict. Our efforts to build bridges between humanity, our advocacy for serving life instead of conflicts, and our dedication to the people of the world humanity without discriminating against anyone. Perhaps we can call this act of friendship and unity the garden of humanity. And on that note, I would like to leave you with a recap of Affinity's signature event, the 2021 New South Wales Parliament Friendship and Dialogue Iftar Dinner, which was a true and humble reflection of the garden of humanity. Thank you all for joining tonight to reaffirm our commitment to peace across the world. May this special event tonight be a reminder to all of us that we should be resilient in our work together, despite our differences, to achieve a global culture of peace. I would like to invite you to read Steve's fascinating book, Peace in the Age of Chaos, and also welcome you to join the upcoming Affinity Youth webinar. In recognition of the World Youth Skills Day, we will be discussing the 2021 theme of youth unemployment and have to tackle this critical issue. Joining the panel are Philip, Hannah, and Jordan in discussion with SBS journalist Omar Dehan. Thank you and have a good evening.
I'd like to welcome you all to Affinity Intercultural Foundation's 2021 New South Wales Parliament Friendship and Dialogue Ramadan Iftar Dinner.
When we talk about country, we mean something beyond the dictionary definition of the word. It describes the entirety of our ancestral domains and our laws and our dreaming.
I would like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
Thank you. It's fantastic to be here. Can I say it's fantastic to be in a group of more than 20 people and not see you on Zoom. You know, having a dinner, I think, is one of the best ways that from any background, whether a multicultural, multi-faith society, it's a levelling playing field.
But also to acknowledge the wonderful work of Affinity and what Affinity has been able to achieve in this past year. And I'm very honoured and privileged to be your co-host. Thank you once again and have a great evening.
This is an Ebru, a traditional Turkish art. It's formed by sprinkling natural paints over a basin of water, and it received the name Ebru, meaning cloud, to describe the cloud-like image that formed after the paint was sprinkled over the water. We're going to see that in your Zooms, in your interviews. It's a great pleasure to introduce a very familiar face. In fact, it's hard to fathom how many cousins he has.
I would like to call tonight's dinner the Garden of Humanity. The Garden of Humanity is inspired by a desire to celebrate the possibility and perhaps one day the reality of peaceful coexistence among all faiths and all cultures in society. I have 4 words that came to my mind while reflecting on tonight's iftar dinner: courage, vision, dedication, and optimism.
تدخل النار فقد أخزيته وما للظالمين من أنصار.
And I've got to say, one of these beautiful iftar dinners was the final sort of splendid evening that my father ever had. He was 84 and he died 3 months after he went to an iftar dinner at Parliament House. And he came back so joyous after having been to this iftar dinner and just thought it was the most beautiful thing, and this sort of wonderful welcome and inclusion he got.
We as Muslims believe that all humanity comes from one source and are therefore brothers and sisters united in their humanity.
There is much to despair, and yet again, here we all are, different, yet together, with differing worldviews, but able to share a meal in peace. We all think about things differently. We challenge each other by bringing different worldviews. We did change one word of the national anthem, so at least now we are all one. I don't say any of these things with political overtone. I'm not talking about politics, I'm talking about people. We cannot let humanity become politicised. We will never ever all be the same. And isn't that a wonderful thing? We will all take a little something that is different when we leave the room tonight. I give thanks that each of us this evening will take what we have shared together and share it with others from in here to out there.
Continued for my 20 years is that I'm always hopeful, because in my work I see sometimes the worst of humanity, but I certainly see the best of humanity. And tonight we see that reflected amongst everybody here.
I've attended at their invitation on a number of previous iftar dinners. They are a great opportunity to celebrate Ramadan and the cultural inclusivity fostered by affinity.
Today's sponsors represent many different companies. Pfizer Australia Biopharmaceuticals is Anne Harris. For Lenovo Technology Solutions is Nick Finlayson. The Gillespie Foundation is represented by Erhan Bozkurt. Australian Relief Organisation is Nermin Gatz.
Puts it back to Cantor. Cantor ties the single game franchise. The put back, no, again, no. Cantor, most certainly, yes.
I believe sport delivers connection and belonging in the community. It is something that people from all walks of life can join together to play, cheer, celebrate, and appreciate, despite any ethnic, religious, or cultural difference.
This is so important, what's happening in this room this evening. And whilst the energy level might rise a bit when a great Enes Kanter comes on, and that's what sport tends to do. And why? Is because when you look around, you see the true vision of what Australia is. You see, more than that actually is the promise of what we can be. But what is multiculturalism? We accept them? No. Actually, it's saying that we're better together. That's real multiculturalism. We are better together. But Tracy rightly, in her brilliant speech tonight, challenged us to do more, to do something. What we can resolve is to say, well, we're better together, which means, like brothers and sisters, I'm obligated to stand up for you. It's to say, this person next to me is part of this country, is equal to me, and I will fight for you when it's necessary.
A gift from the Garden of Humanity.
I'd like to invite Arti Banga, Editor-in-Chief of Desi Australia, to present a gift to Philippa. It's been a delight. This is about the third or fourth that Alison and I have attended. Ahmet, you're a wonderful man. He's put me in my chronological place by insisting that I'm his uncle, not his cousin. Well, that's all right. I'm your uncle.
Good evening. Ramadan Mubarak. Thank you.